March 8, 1945. Zurich, Switzerland. The city is quiet. The war is elsewhere, in the rubble of Dresden, in the frozen mud outside Budapest, in the dying corridors of Berlin. But in a private apartment on a narrow street, two men are sitting across from each other who should never be in the same room. One is Alan Dulles, 41 years old, station chief of the OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency. Calm, patrician, a man who collects secrets the way others collect stamps. The other is Karl Wolff, SS Obergruppenführer, the highest-ranking SS officer in Italy, a man personally responsible for sending 300,000 human beings to Treblinka. They are not enemies tonight. They are negotiating. No cameras, no record for public eyes, no Soviet representative in the room or anywhere near the building. What happens in the next several hours will not appear in any official Allied communication. It will be buried, rerouted, sanitized, and it will detonate a crisis that nearly shattered the coalition that won the Second World War. The arrangement they reach this night has a name: Operation Sunrise. What it is, officially, is a secret negotiation for the early surrender of German forces in northern Italy. What it actually is, what the documents now show, is something more complicated: a deal between a future CIA director and a man who ran the machinery of genocide, a channel of communication deliberately hidden from an ally that had lost more than 20 million people fighting the same enemy. A backroom agreement made in the final weeks of the war, when the outcome was already decided, and when what was really being negotiated was not surrender terms, but the shape of the world that came after. Stalin found out. Roosevelt received the angriest letter the Soviet leader had ever sent him, and the crack that opened in March 1945 between Washington and Moscow never fully closed. This is the story of how it happened and who benefited. 1. The secret. To understand what was hidden, you have to understand what the rules were. By early 1945, the Allied coalition operated under one non-negotiable principle established at Casablanca in January 1943: unconditional surrender. No side deals, no partial agreements, no separate negotiations with individual German commanders. The three powers, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, had committed to this framework in writing. It was the foundation on which the entire alliance rested. What Alan Dulles was doing in Zurich violated that framework. Not technically, not on paper, Dulles was careful about paper, but in every practical sense that mattered. The first contact hadn't come from the Americans, it came from the Germans. In November 1944, a mid-level SS intelligence officer named Guido Zimmer sat in a meeting in Verona and proposed an idea. Germany was losing. Everyone in that room knew it. The question was not whether the Reich would fall, it was who would be standing over the body. Zimmer's proposal was simple: use an Italian intermediary to open a back channel to Allied intelligence in Switzerland. Find out if there was a deal to be made. The intermediary they selected was Baron Luigi Parilli, a Neapolitan businessman with connections on both sides of the war, a man who moved through occupied Italy with the ease of someone who understood that wars end and commerce continues. In mid-February 1945, Parilli crossed into Switzerland. His mission, as framed to the Swiss contacts who received him, was to prevent the destruction of northern Italy's industrial infrastructure. His actual mission was to test whether the Americans were interested in talking. They were. On March 3, 1945, the first formal contact took place in Lugano. Parilli, SS Colonel Eugen Dollmann, and SS Captain Guido Zimmer sat down with OSS representative Paul Blum. Swiss intelligence officer Max Weibel was present. So was Max Hussmann, a Swiss schoolteacher who had helped arrange the meeting, and who would later describe the encounter as the moment he understood that the war's final chapter was being written not on the battlefield, but in private dining rooms. Dulles himself did not attend. He was watching, vetting, making sure this was real before he put his name anywhere near it. 5 days later, he was satisfied. On the evening of March 8th, Karl Wolff arrived at Dulles's apartment in Zurich. He came with Dolman, with SS Lieutenant Colonel Victor Venner, with Zimmer, with Parilli. But Dulles agreed to see only Wolff. The others waited elsewhere while the two men talked alone. Dulles and his assistant, Gero von Gewernitz, on one side, the highest-ranking SS general in Italy on the other. Wolff's opening position was not a surrender. It was a transaction. He wanted Army Group C, nearly 600,000 German troops, to be allowed to withdraw northward over the Brenner Pass into Austria, where they would continue fighting the Soviet advance. In exchange, he would hand over northern Italy intact. No scorched earth, no destruction of the Po Valley's industry and agriculture. A clean transfer. Dulles said no. Unconditional surrender or nothing. What Wolff wanted, what he needed, was something else entirely. Immunity. For himself, for his officers, for the crimes that were even then being documented in captured files and survivor testimony. He needed the Americans to look the other way. And Dulles, who had described Wolff in his cables back to Washington as a distinctive personality and the most dynamic figure in northern Italy, was listening. The Soviet Union was not informed. On March 11th, 3 days after the Zurich meeting, the Americans and British notified Moscow that preliminary contacts had been made. The notification was deliberately vague. What it omitted was the substance of what had been discussed, the identity of the German representative, and the extent to which Dulles had already moved beyond preliminary contact into active negotiation. Molotov's response arrived within 24 hours. The Soviet government had no objection to negotiations, provided that Soviet military representatives were permitted to participate. The American answer, delivered on March 16th, was a single, flat no. No explanation, no offer of a compromise, no acknowledgement of the alliance principle that had governed every other major military decision for 3 years. Just, the Soviet Union will not be represented at these talks. In Moscow, that answer landed like a confession. What nobody in Washington had fully calculated was how it would look from the other side. The Soviet Union had been absorbing catastrophic casualties since June 1941. By March 1945, conservative estimates placed Soviet military dead at over 8 million. The Red Army had fought from the suburbs of Moscow to the outskirts of Berlin. And now, with victory weeks away, their allies were conducting secret meetings with SS generals and refusing to allow a Soviet officer in the room. The interpretation that formed in the Kremlin was not paranoid, it was logical. If the Americans were negotiating a separate peace with German forces in Italy, those forces could be released to reinforce the Eastern Front. Soviet soldiers would die so that an SS general could cut a deal with the OSS. That was not what was happening, but it was exactly what it looked like. And inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus, a document had already arrived that deepened the suspicion. Intercepted German communications suggested that elements within the Wehrmacht were deliberately holding the line in the west while throwing everything they had against the Red Army in the east. Whether this was coordinated with the Bern negotiations or simply opportunistic was unclear. What was clear was that the pattern fit. The man who would force the confrontation was not Stalin, not yet. It was Vyacheslav Molotov, foreign minister, Stalin's instrument, a man whose diplomatic dispatches read like prosecutorial briefs. On March 22, 1945, Molotov wrote to U.S. Ambassador Averell Harriman in terms that left nothing ambiguous. His letter stated that for 2 weeks, behind the back of the Soviet Union, negotiations between representatives of the German military command and representatives of the American and British command had been conducted in Bern. The Soviet government considered this absolutely inadmissible. The word inadmissible in Soviet diplomatic language was not a complaint, it was a warning. Roosevelt responded on March 25th, defending the contacts as preliminary and non-binding. Stalin replied on March 29th with something that had almost no precedent in the wartime correspondence between the two leaders: a direct accusation. He stated that the Germans had agreed to open the front to Anglo-American forces in exchange for eased armistice terms, and that 3 German divisions had already shifted from Italy to the Eastern Front as a result. The accusation was not entirely accurate, but it was not entirely wrong either, and the man at the center of all of it, Karl Wolff, was still in Switzerland, still talking, still building the deal that would keep him out of Nuremberg. 2. The players. 3 men drove Operation Sunrise. Each of them wanted something different. Each of them got what they came for, at a price the history books have spent 80 years arguing about. Karl Wolff. He was born in Darmstadt in 1900, the son of a district court magistrate. By the standards of SS leadership, he was almost aristocratic. Tall, smooth-mannered, the kind of man who could discuss Renaissance painting and deportation logistics in the same afternoon without visible strain. He joined the Nazi Party in 1931 and the SS shortly after. By 1933, he was Heinrich Himmler's personal adjutant, not a position that required exceptional ideological convictions so much as exceptional social intelligence. Wolff understood how power moved through rooms. He understood what people wanted to hear. He rose quickly. By the time the war began, he was Himmler's chief of staff. He sat at the center of the SS administrative apparatus, processing the paperwork of the final solution with what his 1964 trial would call bureaucratic precision. In July 1942, he received a letter from a senior railway official explaining that 5,000 Jews were now departing daily from Warsaw to Treblinka. Wolff's written response expressed what he called his special joy at the news. That letter would take 20 years to surface. When it did, it ended his freedom. But in March 1945, Wolff was operating on a different calculation entirely. He had been appointed higher SS and police leader in Italy in September 1943, following the fall of Mussolini. He commanded SS forces across the peninsula. He controlled the infrastructure of occupation, and he was intelligent enough to understand, earlier than most of his colleagues, that the war was lost. What Wolff needed was a bridge out. The deal he constructed with Dulles was elegant in its cynicism. He would deliver the surrender of German forces in Italy, an enormous military prize, nearly 1 million men, in exchange for something that was never written down, never officially confirmed, and never officially denied. The understanding that the Americans would protect him from prosecution for what he had done before the surrender. At Nuremberg, Wolff was not indicted. He testified as a prosecution witness instead. He was released from American custody in 1947. The German denazification process sentenced him to a few years, which he served incompletely. He moved to Starnberg, became an advertising executive, built a villa on a lake. It was not until 1962, when the Eichmann trial forced a reckoning with the documentary record, that the letter about Treblinka surfaced and Wolff was arrested again. In 1964, a Munich court sentenced him to 15 years. He was released in 1971, citing illness, and retired to the Austrian countryside. He died in 1984. He never expressed remorse for anything except, occasionally, the inconvenience of having been caught. Allen Dulles. He arrived in Bern in November 1942 with a cover story and a talent for collecting people who needed someone to talk to. His official position was that of a diplomat. His actual position was as the OSS's most important European intelligence officer, running agents across occupied Europe from a city that sat at the intersection of every intelligence service on the continent. Dulles was the grandson of one Secretary of State and the nephew of another. He had been briefed by a Russian émigré in Bern in 1917, who turned out to be Lenin. He had the instincts of someone who had grown up understanding that the world was run by people in rooms that most people never knew existed. He was also, by the spring of 1945, a man who understood that the war was ending, and that what came after would be determined by who held what cards. His anti-Soviet orientation was not a secret within the OSS. His belief that the real long-term threat to American interests was not Nazi Germany, but Soviet expansion was, by March 1945, shaping every decision he made in Bern. The exclusion of Soviet representatives from the Sunrise negotiations was not a bureaucratic oversight. It was a choice. Dulles believed, and argued in his cables to Washington, that Soviet participation would complicate and potentially destroy any possibility of a negotiated surrender. That the Soviets would use the talks to extract intelligence, delay proceedings, and push for terms favorable to communist influence in post-war Italy. He was probably right about some of that. He was certainly right that Soviet participation would have changed the outcome. That was precisely why Moscow wanted in, and precisely why Washington kept them out.
What Dulles got from Sunrise was considerable. A significant military surrender, accomplished through intelligence work rather than battlefield action, weeks before Germany's final collapse. A demonstration that the OSS could deliver results that justified its continued existence in the post-war world. And a personal reputation as a man who had outmaneuvered the SS, the Wehrmacht, and his own government's bureaucracy to bring about a strategic victory. His book on the operation, published in 1966, presented it as an unambiguous triumph. By then, he had served as director of the CIA, presided over the Bay of Pigs disaster, and been fired by John F. Kennedy. The post-war consensus on Sunrise was kinder to him than his later record perhaps warranted. What the documents showed, particularly after the CIA released portions of the Sunrise file in the 1990s and 2000s, was a more complicated picture. A man who had given Wolf implicit assurances that were never officially acknowledged, who had intervened after the war to protect several of his Sunrise contacts from prosecution, whose anti-Soviet instincts had contributed to a crisis that damaged the alliance at its most critical moment. The crack in the wall between Washington and Moscow that opened in March 1945 did not close when the war ended. It widened. Dulles was not the cause of the Cold War, but he understood it before almost anyone else, and in Bern, in the spring of 1945, he was already building for it. Vyacheslav Molotov. He was the man who figured it out first. Molotov had served as Soviet foreign minister since 1939. He had signed the Non-Aggression Pact with Ribbentrop. He had delivered the announcement of the German invasion to the Soviet people in June 1941. He was, by 1945, one of the most experienced and most suspicious diplomatic minds in the world, a man who had survived Stalin's purges by being indispensable, and who had learned that the gap between what Allies said and what Allies did was always worth measuring. When the first notification of the Bern contacts arrived from Washington in mid-March, Molotov read it carefully. Then he read it again. The vagueness was itself informative. The refusal to allow Soviet participation was more informative still. By March 22nd, when he delivered his note to Harriman, he had already concluded that the Americans were not conducting preliminary contacts. They were conducting negotiations, and they were conducting them specifically to exclude the Soviet Union from the outcome. His letter to Harriman was a diplomatic grenade with the pin already pulled. It named what was happening. It used the phrase, "behind the back of the Soviet Union." It called the situation absolutely inadmissible, and it put the Americans in the position of either confessing to what they were doing or denying something that the Soviets clearly already knew. Roosevelt denied it. Stalin replied on March 29th with the accusation about German divisions shifting to the Eastern Front. Roosevelt fired back that the information came from German sources designed to sow discord among the Allies. The exchange that followed, 4 letters in 10 days between 2 dying men and their surrogates, was the most honest the Allied leadership had been with each other since Yalta. And what it revealed, underneath the diplomatic language, was that the trust that had carried the coalition through 4 years of war had already begun to dissolve. Molotov had seen it coming. That was the one thing he got right. What he got wrong was thinking that naming it would stop it. 3. The document/the moment. March 29, 1945. The Kremlin. Stalin's letter to Roosevelt is 3 pages. It is typed on plain paper in Russian and translated before transmission. By the standards of wartime correspondence between the 2 leaders, which had been careful, often warm, occasionally tense, it is extraordinary. It does not open with pleasantries. Stalin stated that he had analyzed Roosevelt's letter of March 25th and found it unsatisfactory. He noted that Soviet representatives had been barred from the Bern negotiations. He stated that the German command on the Western Front had, in practice, ceased serious resistance to Anglo-American forces. He stated that 3 German divisions had transferred from Italy to the Soviet front. He drew the connection explicitly. The Germans were fighting the Red Army while making arrangements with the West. Then he went further. He wrote that he could not agree that a difference of views between allies justified the conclusion of secret arrangements with the enemy. He wrote that the Soviet government had not been informed and had not consented. He wrote that if the situation were reversed, if the Soviet Union were conducting secret negotiations with German forces on the Eastern Front and excluding its Western allies, he was certain that the reaction from London and Washington would be considerably sharper than the protests Moscow was now making. The letter is preserved in the Roosevelt Library at Hyde Park. It reads, 80 years later, like a closing argument. Roosevelt's response, drafted with the help of his advisers and transmitted on April 5th, is the document that history has most often quoted from this exchange. He expressed what the letter called astonishment at Stalin's allegations. He stated categorically that no negotiations had taken place in Bern, only preliminary contacts. He insisted that Soviet officers would be welcome at any future discussion of unconditional surrender terms. He suggested that Stalin's information had come from German sources, deliberately attempting to divide the Allies. Then, in the final paragraph, Roosevelt wrote something that no American president had ever written to Stalin before. He said that the Soviet allegations, if allowed to stand, would create distrust that would cast a grave doubt on Allied unity and on the prospects for the post-war world. It was, in the language of their correspondence, the equivalent of a warning. 7 days later, Roosevelt was dead. He died at Warm Springs, Georgia, on April 12, 1945, of a cerebral hemorrhage. The letter had been his last major communication on the Sunrise affair. The man who received it, who read it in Moscow and then set it aside, was the same man who had been telling Washington for 3 weeks that something was wrong in Switzerland. Stalin was right, and he knew that Roosevelt had known he was right. Harry Truman, who assumed the presidency within hours of Roosevelt's death, had been kept almost entirely in the dark about Sunrise. He had not been briefed on the Bern negotiations, on the Wolf contacts, on the exchange with Stalin. He learned about all of it simultaneously in the first chaotic days of his presidency, while trying to understand what kind of war he had inherited and what kind of alliance he was now responsible for. His instinct, shaped by advisers who included the increasingly anti-Soviet Harriman, was to take a harder line with Moscow than Roosevelt had. His first meeting with Molotov on April 23rd became famous for its bluntness. Truman told the Soviet foreign minister that agreements had to be kept. Molotov replied that he had never been spoken to like that in his life. Truman told him to carry out his agreements, and he wouldn't get talked to like that. The exchange lasted minutes. Its consequences lasted decades.
Meanwhile, in northern Italy, the deal was falling apart. Wolf had returned from Zurich to face the consequences of what he had done. Hitler had not been informed. Himmler had not been informed. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Security Main Office and one of the most dangerous men in the SS hierarchy, had ordered on March 12th that all contacts with the Swiss be immediately terminated. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the overall German commander in Italy, had been transferred to the Western Front, removing the one senior Wehrmacht officer whose cooperation might have accelerated a surrender. His replacement, General Heinrich von Viertinghoff, stalled, then stalled again, then received a direct order from Berlin to continue fighting. The weeks that had seemed to promise a quick resolution stretched into April, then toward the end of April, while Soviet forces fought street by street through Berlin and the rest of the German front disintegrated. On April 26th, something almost operatic happened. Italian partisans captured Karl Wolff. The highest-ranking SS officer in Italy, the man conducting the most sensitive secret negotiation of the final weeks of the war, was seized by the resistance and held at gunpoint. He was rescued by OSS operatives working with Swiss intelligence, who physically extracted him from partisan custody and returned him to the negotiating process. The Americans rescued a war criminal to close a deal. The surrender document was finally signed on April 29, 1945, at Allied headquarters in Caserta. The German signatories were Lieutenant Colonel Victor von Schweinitz, representing the Wehrmacht, and SS Major Eugen Wenner, representing the SS. A Soviet general was present. Truman had insisted on it over the objections of some in the American command, but as an observer, not a participant. The ceasefire took effect on May 2nd. Germany's unconditional surrender to all Allied powers followed on May 8th. The gap between those two dates, 6 days, had cost lives. How many is a number that historians have debated without resolution because the variables are impossible to isolate. What is not debated is that German forces continued fighting on the Eastern Front through those 6 days, and that Soviet soldiers died in them. The document signed at Caserta represented, on its face, exactly what Dulles had promised: an unconditional surrender, no political concessions, no separate peace. What it did not show, what no document showed, was the understanding that had been reached across a table in Zurich 7 weeks earlier. The implicit guarantee that had kept Wolff talking through Himmler's interference, through Kaltenbrunner's orders, through the nearly month-long suspension of contacts that followed Soviet pressure in April. Wolff was not prosecuted at Nuremberg. He testified instead. The documents that might have clarified exactly what was promised to him, the full record of what Dulles said in that Zurich apartment on the night of March 8th, were classified by the CIA. Portions were released in the 1990s under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. Other portions remain restricted. What the released documents confirm is that Dulles was aware of Wolff's war crimes before the negotiations began, that he described Wolff in internal cables as someone worth dealing with despite that record, that after the war he intervened on behalf of at least one other Sunrise participant, SS Captain Guido Zimmer, to protect him from prosecution on the grounds that he had served American interests. The deal was real. The immunity was real. It was just never written down anywhere that anyone has been allowed to read in full. The cover-up. The first version of events was simple. Operation Sunrise was a military success, cleanly executed, that saved lives by ending the Italian campaign early. The Soviet objections were the product of paranoia, of Stalin's habitual suspicion of his Western allies, of a worldview that saw betrayal in every back-channel communication. That version held for 20 years. It held because the people who knew otherwise either didn't talk or controlled what was written. Dulles was first among them. In the immediate post-war period, the OSS was disbanded and its officers scattered across the emerging American intelligence apparatus. Dulles moved into private law practice, then back into government service, eventually becoming director of the CIA in 1953. Throughout this period, the operational files of Sunrise remained classified. The cables between Bern and Washington, the records of what Dulles actually said to Wolf in Zurich, the internal assessments of how the operation had affected Soviet-American relations, all of it locked away. What the public got instead was Dulles's own account. In 1966, he published The Secret Surrender. It is a well-written book. It is also, in several important respects, a carefully managed one. Dulles presents Sunrise as a straightforward intelligence operation conducted within the boundaries of Allied policy. The Soviet objections are framed as a misunderstanding, an episode of unfortunate friction that was ultimately resolved. Wolf is portrayed as a complex figure who took genuine risks to end the war. The question of what promises were made to him is not addressed. The book became the primary source for most subsequent accounts of the operation. For a generation of historians, it shaped what Sunrise was understood to mean. Wolf, for his part, was not talking publicly about what had been agreed in Zurich. He had reasons to stay quiet. After his 1964 conviction, he was in prison. After his 1971 release, he was a man trying to live out his remaining years without attracting further attention from prosecutors. He gave interviews. He appeared in documentaries, including the landmark British series The World at War. He discussed the internal workings of the SS, his relationship with Himmler, the mechanics of the occupation in Italy. He did not discuss the specifics of what Dulles had promised him. Max Hussmann, the Swiss schoolteacher who had helped arrange the first contacts, was less discreet. In 1947, he wrote a letter at the request of Telford Taylor, chief counsel of the U.S. prosecution at Nuremberg, stating explicitly that promises of immunity had been made to Wolf during the Sunrise negotiations, though Dulles could not confirm this in writing because of the political sensitivity of the situation. That letter sat in files for decades. The mechanism of concealment was not a dramatic conspiracy. It was something more mundane and more durable: classification, institutional interest, and the simple fact that the people who knew the most had the most to lose from a full accounting. The CIA did not want its founding generation associated with deals that protected war criminals. The West German government, navigating its own relationship with the Nazi past, had limited appetite for digging into the Sunrise files. The American government, increasingly focused on the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, found it difficult to simultaneously pursue accountability for Sunrise while recruiting former SS and Wehrmacht officers into the Gehlen organization, the West German intelligence service built largely from Nazi-era personnel, with CIA support. The wall held until 1998. The Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, passed by the U.S. Congress that year, mandated the declassification and release of government records related to Nazi war crimes and the post-war use of Nazi personnel. The CIA, the FBI, the military services, and other agencies were required to review millions of documents and release those that could be declassified without endangering current operations or personnel. What came out of that process over the following years was fragmentary but significant. The files on Guido Zimmer confirmed that American officials had intervened to protect him from prosecution. Records related to other Sunrise participants showed a pattern of preferential treatment, informal protection, and active lobbying by OSS and CIA officers on behalf of men who had committed documented atrocities. The full Dulles-Wolf communications from the Zurich meeting of March 8th have not been released.
The CIA has confirmed that records related to Operation Sunrise exist in classified holdings. It has confirmed that some of those records relate to commitments made during the negotiations. It has not confirmed what those commitments were. This is what 80 years of the cover-up looks like when it partially fails. Not a revelation, but a silhouette. The shape of something that cannot quite be seen directly, visible only because of what surrounds it. The protected war criminals, the classified cables, the carefully worded memoir that answers every question except the one that matters most. What did Dulles promise Carl Wolf? The answer is somewhere in a file in Langley, Virginia, that has not yet been opened. 5. Consequences. The numbers first, because the numbers are what history tends to skip. The surrender signed at Caserta on April 29th covered approximately 900,000 German and Italian fascist troops. It took effect on May 2nd. Germany's general surrender followed on May 8th. In those 6 days between the Italian ceasefire and the European war's end, Soviet forces were still fighting. In the streets of Berlin, in Czechoslovakia, in Austria. The casualty figures for those final days of the Eastern Front run into the tens of thousands. How many of those deaths were connected to the prolonged Italian negotiations, to the weeks of delay caused by Himmler's interference, Vietinghof's stalling, the mid-April suspension of talks forced by Soviet pressure, is a question without a clean answer. Military historians are careful about counterfactuals. What can be said is that the Italian surrender came later than it might have, and that the gap between April and May 1945 on the Eastern Front was paid in blood. The political consequences were less ambiguous. The Sunrise Crisis did not cause the Cold War. That explanation is too simple, and the Cold War had structural causes that no single episode could have created or prevented. But it accelerated something. It demonstrated to the Soviet leadership, at the precise moment when post-war arrangements were being negotiated, that Western promises of consultation and transparency had limits, and that those limits appeared exactly when Soviet interests were most directly engaged. The UN Founding Conference in San Francisco, which opened in late April 1945, was affected. Soviet participation was colder and more combative than American planners had anticipated. The diplomatic goodwill that had carried the Big Three through Yalta, just 2 months earlier, had been significantly eroded by the Bern Exchange. Some historians have described Sunrise as the first episode of the Cold War. That framing overstates the case. What it undeniably was is one of the first moments when the post-war world's defining conflict became visible beneath the surface of the wartime alliance. Carl Wolf lived until 1984. He spent his post-prison years at a lake house in the Austrian countryside, gave interviews to documentary filmmakers, served as a consultant on a forged set of Hitler's diaries, and appears to have experienced no significant period of reflection about the 300,000 people whose deaths he had described with joy in a 1942 letter. His grave is in Prien am Chiemsee. It receives no visitors worth counting. Alan Dulles was fired as CIA director in 1961, following the Bay of Pigs disaster, by a president who blamed him for what a contemporary described as a spectacular failure of judgment. He spent his final years writing and giving interviews. He died in 1969. His reputation within the intelligence community remains, to this day, complex. The architect of Cold War covert operations, the man who built the CIA into what it became, and the man who sat across from an SS general in Zurich in March 1945 and made a deal that he never fully disclosed to the people he worked for.
The Soviet files on Sunrise have never been fully released. Russian archives from this period remain largely inaccessible to outside researchers. What the KGB knew, when they knew it, and how it shaped Soviet policy in the final months of the war, these are questions that the documentary record cannot yet answer. What it can answer is narrower and more unsettling. A man who organized the murder of 300,000 people walked out of Nuremberg as a witness. He did so because he was useful, because the Americans who had sat across from him decided that what he could deliver was worth more than what he had done. And the mechanism that protected him, the classification, the managed memoir, the files that remain closed, is the same mechanism that protects dozens of similar arrangements from the same period, involving the same institutions, serving the same strategic interests. Operation Sunrise ended on May 2, 1945. The question it raises has never been answered. What is an ally worth? And what is a war criminal worth to the side that wants something from him? The documents that could tell us are still waiting to be opened. Go back to that apartment in Zurich, March 8, 1945. 2 men in a room. No record, no cameras, no witnesses except those who understood the value of forgetting. Outside, the city is quiet. The war is elsewhere. The outcome is already decided. Hitler will be dead in 53 days. Germany will surrender in 61. What is being decided in this room is something else. It is being decided that a man who wrote Special Joy about trainloads of human beings heading to Treblinka will not stand in the dock at Nuremberg. That he will live in comfort in the Austrian countryside for nearly 4 decades. That the files documenting what was promised to him will be classified for longer than his natural life. It is being decided in this room that the alliance which had held the world together against fascism was already something different from what it appeared, already dividing, already calculating, already oriented toward the next competition rather than the final victory of the current one. Stalin figured that out in March 1945. He was right about what was happening, if wrong about some of the details. The letter he sent Roosevelt was the last honest accounting of what the alliance had become. Roosevelt died before he could answer it properly. The world that came after, the Cold War, the decades of mutual suspicion, the arms race, the proxy conflicts, was not born in that Zurich apartment, but it was previewed there. 2 men shook hands. Everyone else paid the price.